Good evening and welcome to In Focus, brought to you live this evening from the Up North Media Center. I'm your host, Kimberli Bindschatel. With me is my co-host, Anthony Weber. And tonight, In Focus is water, the crisis of this generation. Our guests are, starting here, Krystn Madrine. She's an artist and activist, particularly focused on water and water issues. Next to her is Christine Crissman. She's the executive director of the Watershed Center Grand Traverse Bay. They do focus on water quality issues as well and advocate for clean water in the Great Lakes region. And Carl Ganter is with us as well. He is a photojournalist and the director and founder of Circle of Blue, an international organization based right here in Traverse City that also focuses on water and water issues around the globe. Thank you, all three of you, for being with us tonight.
Great to be here.
Pleasure. So water, the crisis of this generation. I've been saying this for years and years. And Carl, I think if you could start for us, maybe you can, I've been saying that really truly anecdotally, and I'm kind of hoping that you can back that up scientifically and other information. And just start out, if you will, an overview of what is the crisis, what is an issue with water, and what's going on in the world, to just give us a launching
Well, I guess
point.
the place to start is what isn't an issue with water. So what I thought I'd do is, I'm a journalist and photographer, and we cover water issues around the world, and you're absolutely correct in saying this is the biggest story of the century. It's really the biggest drama playing out around the world because it intersects everything we care about. So what I'd love to do is, since I'm a photographer and I work with journalists, is give you a little bit of a sense, not in the super details and the bullet points and all the numbers, but just a little sense around the world of our itinerary and what we're seeing, if that's okay.
You brought some images for us.
I did bring some pictures.
Excellent.
I always carry my camera, but I wanted to start with a picture. Let's go orbital for a second. So this is Mir. This is the Mir spacecraft, and this is where astronaut Jerry Linenger lived for about 4 months in orbit around the water planet. And Jerry Linenger is a neighbor of us here in northern Michigan. And he looked down, he spent that time looking down on the water planet and just seeing how water connected everything. It connected cities, civilizations, ecosystems. And he literally picked this region in the Great Lakes as the place to live because of the water. But to use a metaphor, Houston, we have a problem. So we have children around the world, like this 3-year-old in Ghana, who carry water for sometimes 6 hours a day. They carry water, they have to get it from either a well or maybe a pond, and that water usually is not safe to drink. So a couple key numbers that you really need to know is that 1 billion people around the world, close to 1 billion people around the world, don't have access to safe water, something that we take for granted here in Up North Michigan. About 2 billion people don't have access to a place to go to the bathroom. So you have water and sanitation. So you really can't talk about one without talking about the other. So this graphic here is from the World Economic Forum. Actually, if we go back one slide, water was named this year in January by the World Economic Forum, which hosts the big meeting in Davos every year. I've been a member of the forum's Global Agenda Council on water security. Water hit #1 on the list of the top things that we need to be worried about. This is the list that's handed out to global leaders, it's handed out to ministers, it's really kind of the barometer for what's happening around the world. So if you look at the list, you have geopolitical risk, you have conflict, but water crises, and that's with a plural, is the #1 risk of greatest impact. And it's kind of a Pyrrhic victory to have it ranked #1. Yes, we're relevant. Yes, water is important. Yes, you're watching. You're hearing us talk about the #1 issue on the planet. But when we roll to, when we talk about these issues, we look at what's happening around the planet. And here's a view from Mir, and this is in fact a dust storm. We talk about why is Beijing so dusty and so dirty? What's happening in LA? So this dust is blowing around the world. It's all connected. Well, I like to drop a string, so to speak. So if I could parachute out of Jerry's spacecraft and land in the middle of China somewhere, this is where I would land. And this is the epicenter of climate change. It's also the epicenter of a lot of the air pollution and actually water scarcity challenges in China. These are the giant coal mines in Inner Mongolia that are fueling China. And so they're also draining the water table because it takes a lot of water to mine and process coal. So I like to find out who's near these, who's affected, who are the real people. These aren't just numbers. So I literally parachuted in, well, not out of the plane, but knocked on the door and said, "Hi, I'm from Michigan," to an Inner Mongolian shepherd family, and met Wu Yun, and this is a daughter of a shepherd. And then she pointed out behind her is a coal mine, and behind her is another coal mine. Their well is dry because the mines are draining the water table. And it's a 15-kilometer drive to get water for their sheep and for their horses. So if we can go to the next slide, we fanned out, it was one of a team of Circle Blue Scent around China. We had 4 separate teams to really peel back the layers of this competition between water and energy in China. So when we talk about water, it's water, food, and energy. It's really this nexus, this relationship globally is part of that big story. So we found that China doesn't have enough water to continue mining and processing coal at current rates. Now, if you stop for a second, that's a big deal. That's the biggest risk to China's GDP growth is they don't have enough water to mine and process coal. What happens if the Yellow River goes dry? What happens if it starts to really start peeling back the layers? So we have this big drama that's playing out around the world. And if we go to Australia and look at what Australia went through in the last 12 years of their drought, you see in the top picture there a rice paddy. Well, they no longer grow rice basically in the desert. That was grown with groundwater because they had this epic drought. So they were draining their groundwater. The surface water wasn't available. And people like Gilbert Bain in the lower picture there, who I flagged down while he was literally trying to harvest the meager bits of wheat that he was trying to grow in a former rice paddy. The drought was so bad that farmers were taking their own lives. It was absolutely that serious. So Australia now has re-engineered how it manages its water. But if we go to our next slide, this is Doha, and this is in the Middle East. So when we talk about water crises, you also talk about food, and you also talk about the things they don't have. They don't have water, they don't have food, but they have energy. So what can they do with that energy? They can build gigantic desalination plants to take the salt out of the water, basically by pure brute force of energy, forcing water at either high pressure or evaporating it to take the salt out. And this is what a desal plant looks like. But then also, this is downtown Doha, and they irrigate with desal water. Even the glass is green in the buildings, but this is in the middle of the desert. So when we talk about water in the future, we're talking about the value, we're talking about how much energy you're willing to put into getting and maintaining and managing that water. So next on our little tour, we go to the next slide. This is in India. So this is another challenge, this water food challenge, and also the water energy challenge. When water doesn't have a value, the farmers literally turn on their pumps and they never turn them off. This is groundwater that's being pumped for flood irrigation for winter wheat, which is not necessary. So what's happening when they let their pumps run 24/7? They're draining their groundwater unnecessarily because they can, right? So if we go to the next slide, what else is happening in India? So they're trying to find solutions to the energy challenge by building dams at the base of the Himalayas, which is the major supply of water for India, Pakistan, and China. But what's happening with climate change is we're seeing the mountains are pushing back. So we're seeing these gigantic floods. Over 2 days, a year and a half ago, these big floods came through, just like a Ridley Scott movie, with gigantic boulders. This is all that's left of one of the big dams. This is India's bet on hydropower and powering the nation is literally being ripped apart by the floods unleashed from the Himalayas. So we have a major water energy challenge. If we go to Mexico, in the Tehuacan Valley of Mexico, we're seeing climate change impacts. We're also seeing over-extraction of groundwater. So this is where people literally go now for their drinking water and also to water their animals. But what's also happening is, for the first time in their history, is farmers are having to actually buy water. Imagine you as a farmer who always had water in your well. All of a sudden now you have to spend half of your income buying water just to water your crops. And also we're seeing immigration issues. This is Francisca Rosa Valencia. We're seeing immigration issues. Why are young people leaving the farms, leaving the rural areas and going to the cities, and even coming north to the US? Because the wells are going dry, because there are no jobs and there's no agriculture. So if we go to the next slide, you look at the United States. Now across the border, come north, and you have Lake Mead. So if Lake Mead drops below another, 13 feet or so, below 1,075 feet above sea level, we'll have an automatic shortage declaration on the Colorado River. So this feeds the Central Valley in California. This also feeds Arizona. And this is the Central Arizona Project Canal, a picture I shot last year just south of Las Vegas. At the very, very end of that is Phoenix. And so literally a thin blue line is supplying the water for our economies, for our agriculture, and for our cities. So if we go to the next slide, in the central US, one of the biggest challenges too is groundwater. How do we preserve, how do we maintain and manage our groundwater? Every one of these crop circles you see from the sky, that's a straw into the ground, into the Ogallala Aquifer. And that aquifer is dropping at an unsustainable rate. So when we talk about national water policy and managing our water, we need to look at how we're using groundwater. And as I hope we'll hear a lot more this evening too, is the algae blooms and the Great Lakes management. So we saw water supplies, water intake shut down for Toledo last fall because of algae blooms, toxic algae blooms primarily from agricultural runoff. And so another big national challenge here is our own Great Lakes. How are we going to manage the water quality there? And the next slide, California. That's going to be the big story of the summer. For the U.S., and it already is now. This is just a couple of weeks ago. California is in epic drought, and so how will that play out? And that's a story we're following, but it's also a story of warning. It's also a story of impetus for action for how we manage our water. So that's a quick little tour of kind of what's happening and what we're seeing in our lenses around the world.
Excellent, thank you.
So it sounds like technology or the need for energy is fueling a lot of these situations where water is disappearing, so to speak. Is this crisis unprecedented in human history because of the unique nature, all the reasons water is being used to support the lifestyle that we have around the world? Or can you look at other times in history where there's been equally daunting challenges when it came to water?
Well, I guess it's all a matter of scale. That's a great question. But you know, today we have, with population and with population density, with the urban centers, we have this really big challenge, and I'll come back to that idea of the nexus. So if you squeeze on the energy part, you squeeze the water part. And so it takes a lot of water to make energy, whether you're mining coal or whether you're running hydro. It takes a lot of energy to move water. And so we're kind of moving the decimal point as far as the impacts and the scale. One other quick little point is you saw that canal, the Central Arizona Project. It is the largest user of electricity in the entire state of Arizona. It uses more electricity in a day to pump that water to Phoenix and into Arizona than it does to power 140,000 residences for a year. That's how big the pumps are, wow. And that's how tightly knit this energy-water relationship is.
I'm wondering, when I've talked about water and water issues with laymen, if you will, in the past, it kind of always comes up, they say, well, you know, water has a natural cycle where water, you use water, you flush the toilet or whatever, or you irrigate, it evaporates, right? It goes up to clouds and then it rains back down. I see you grinning already. And I've always thought, I don't know how to you know, make an argument to that logic, if you will, although I think I understand it. So maybe one of you, maybe Christine, I know you maybe are more knowledgeable on biological, you know, that kind of thing. Can you kind of address that? How that process isn't keeping up, or?
Right. I think the biggest key is, I mean, water, there's not an infinite amount of water, right? So there's a finite amount of water in the world. So yes, it is true that water does cycle and all of those things happen, but there's a sort of a regional aspect to it, a global aspect to it, and the fact that there isn't an endless supply of water. So in one certain area, you could have, you know, like take the Great Lakes, you have 20% of the Earth's surface fresh water in our area. We have an abundance of water, and we take it for granted. cycles and stuff of how water evaporates and comes back down doesn't necessarily all stay in the Great Lakes. You know, just as if the water I'm pumping out of my well could potentially affect the water that my neighbor is going to pump out of their well. So there is sort of this, everything doesn't happen in the same area. So water that is used in one area could be deposited again later in another area, and it doesn't necessarily have a cycle. You know, it doesn't go from the groundwater at my house to the clouds above my house and then come back down and replenish itself. So there are areas that have a great abundance of water, and then there's areas that have a severe lack of water. So, you know, yes, it cycles, but there isn't an infinite amount of water. And at some point, you know, we could potentially run out of water. And we're seeing it happen in the areas that, you know, don't have that abundance of water just naturally right now. And it's only going to get worse in those areas, and it's going to put a lot of pressure on areas like the Great Lakes to try to help the folks that are going through more of a water crisis. And, you know, to be able to make it a little more evenly spread out, which, you know, water just isn't. It's just not the nature of it.
Well, you said we take it for granted here, and I hate to admit it, but probably 20 years ago I was out west, out in New Mexico, and stayed at a hotel, in a Motel 6 or something like that, and I went to take a shower, and it was literally a trickle out of the shower head, and I called the front desk and said, something's wrong, you know, the shower's not working in my room, and I explained to her what was going on, and she said, where are you from? And I thought, oh, what a weird question. I said, well, I'm from Michigan. Yeah, and she hung up the phone. You know, it was not a really fancy hotel. But it was, to me, very, you know, one of those moments where I just thought, God, I'm an idiot, you know, like, I'm from Michigan, water's no big deal. You turn on the tap and there it is. So I imagine that education is the number one thing, that, you know, to start with education. And I know, Krystn, you have been working on some projects as an artist and trying to kind of get the information out as well about that. And I'm a believer in art as a way of communicating. Can you speak to that a little bit, and maybe the issues that you've found to be issues that need to be communicated in different ways that we can try to do that? All the things we're going to talk about probably a little bit more, but to kind of get out there and say...
It all goes exactly to what Carl was saying about how energy and water go together. You can't really talk about one without talking about the other, and we consume an atrocious amount of energy. We are constantly now trying to find the last bits of oil that we can find to keep up our insatiable habit. And so the work that I've done over the years on energy has also been about what that does to water. And then you can't talk about our clean water here having the 20% of the fresh water that we do without talking about how does energy use influence what we make choices about when we talk about the Great Lakes. And so, for instance, right now we're doing the national conversation has been very much about the Keystone XL pipeline, which President Obama vetoed this week. And that's one of the biggest causes that I've agitated for, going to Washington and lobbying and marching and writing and calling, and that's definitely been one of my causes. And the tar sands extraction, for every 1 gallon of gasoline that you could use in your automobile, for every 1 gallon, it takes 6 gallons of water to make that. And so that's just super energy intensive. And so there's that use of water with energy. And then in the state of Michigan, we have a really interesting problem because one of the tar sand pipelines goes under the Mackinac Bridge in the Straits of Mackinac. And it's a 61-year-old pipeline, and pipelines fail and pipelines leak, and this particular company has a pretty bad track record of leaks. And if there were a leak in that pipeline, it would affect Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Mackinac Island, and everything downstream. Everything that we hold sacred here in northern Michigan is actually threatened by that energy choice. And so those are the things that I address when I do any art. It is always about energy and about water, photography, graphic design, drawing, illustration. I'm a student at NMC in the art department right now, and so I use every single assignment that I'm given to agitate and educate about these issues, because not enough people know about them or take it seriously, that we really have to get a grip on the energy so we can keep our water, and get a grip on our water so we don't ruin it with energy.
I was just wanted to add on, I was up in Alberta and near the tar sands. I visited the refinery area and things like that. And one of the professors at the University of Alberta gave me a perfect quote. He said, "The price of oil will be determined by the value of water."
There you go.
And when you step back from that, that's absolutely true. And what's interesting too is that is we're entering this era of the two words, great cheerful words, disruption and risk. And what we're seeing is at these global forums, again, back to the World Economic Forum, it's got World Economic in the middle, is we're seeing the whole idea of risk, and how much risk are we, whether we're economies or whether we're teachers or whether we're just consumers or companies, how much risk are we willing to take? Are we willing to risk a 60-year-old pipeline underneath the Straits of Mackinac, and what level and funding that balance of kind of cost and awareness and risk?
I think it's fascinating to hear that connection between water and gas, because whenever we see prices fluctuate, at least here in northern Michigan, water is never part of the conversation about why might this be happening. It's usually global politics or different things of that nature, but I don't think I've ever heard someone offer the idea that the cost of water as it rises other places is affecting the cost at the gas pump. Christine, I was going to ask you, as Carl was giving us a tour kind of around the world of a lot of different places where you see water being affected, and he mentioned Lake Mead being a lake that's dropping and is impacted by this. How are our Great Lakes doing? Do you see a shift, or do you see concerns in general, whether it's the water level or the algae or sediments, or what's the state of our lakes?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's not easily answered, but there's a lot of pieces to that puzzle. There's a lot more pressure these days in terms of who has access to that water for drinkable water, even locally. There's some lines drawn where these folks are allowed to take their water from the Great Lakes and the folks on the other side are not. And there's some fights and stuff going on right now, even for folks that live right next to the Great Lakes, struggling to get access to that water. And that's sort of the first step. There's been talk of shipping our water out west even. So there's always that talk about water diversion, or the taking water to other places that need water. Then there's the sort of the nutrient sediment inputs that are going into the water these days. It feels like once we get a handle on something else pops up. So we did a good job. We saw there's these what we call point source pollution. So you could say this factory or this farm is doing this. We've done a pretty good job of those. We've reduced phosphorus. We've reduced nitrogen a little bit. But then there's the next step, and now we're at that next step, which is the non-point source. So it's things that just come off as runoff over the land. You can't point to exactly where it comes from. Those are a lot harder to control, a lot harder to say, here's what we should do because here's what the problem is. If you're talking about what folks are doing, say, in the Great Lakes, having actually an effect on the Gulf of Mexico. People don't think about that chain of how it comes from the Great Lakes and will make its way down. And the folks that are actually up at the headwaters have the biggest influence on what happens to the people downstream of them as well. So trying to get a handle on what does that mean, and as nutrients and sediments and things are going into the water, and it's not as easy to point to here's your solution, how do we get a handle on those things and try to control that? And then those things are going to have an effect too on the sort of the health of the water. So those things lead to things like algal blooms and just the health of the ecosystem itself. So there are a lot of issues that are surrounding the Great Lakes, and I think that it sort of depends on what the hot button issue is at the time as to what folks and our legislators and stuff are actually working on. I think just a day or so ago, Congress passed a bill that actually asked the EPA to look at, what are some potential toxic algae issues that we could have, and are we going to manage that? So that was in direct response to Toledo, folks in Toledo not having drinking water. And that's sort of the kind of the fight of the day, because it was a really big thing. But in a couple of months, it could be something else. Or, there's folks that are trying to get, drinking water from Lake Michigan, like I mentioned, and they're fighting for that. So that could be the next big thing. It really is sort of what is the big crisis at the time, and here's our little Band-Aid for it. And I don't feel like there's a really good sort of overlook at the entire system, and how do we work towards larger goals instead of putting kind of Band-Aids on smaller issues.
Are there risks as well to who controls that, the source of drinking water? And I know in places in the world, and maybe you can speak to the specifics of this, where, well, we had an example of Nestle coming in, right, and with the Ice Mountain plant, and sucking up so much water that the neighbors' wells ran dry apparently. But more to the point of a corporation, owning a water source for profit to sell water, that's a huge issue, and I'm sure around the world, I mean, wars will be fought over this, right?
And they already are.
So
Yes.
So can any of the three of you speak to that a little bit and give us a better sense of how that's already kind of manifesting in different places in the world and how it's being settled already? Who controls water sources for profit?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think there's, and maybe you have more on the groundwater side here. But what I'm seeing is since about 2007 or so, we're seeing a big transition in again how even companies are looking at their water, we'll call it water risk, so to speak. And so you're seeing companies like, most of them with clear self-interest, but companies like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle, even Rio Tinto, the mining company, doing full risk analyses across their full supply chains as far as water risk. So Coca-Cola, 6 or 7 years ago, was one of the first companies on the planet to do a full climate change risk analysis. How will climate change affect their water supplies? Mm-hmm. And so now you're seeing primarily Coca-Cola, Nestle, I think Pepsi a little bit. Again, obvious, they're beverage companies, right? And they grow sugar. They need sugar for sugar cane, so it's usually water intensive. Aluminum, that's water intensive to put it in cans. So they have huge water footprints, and so they're investing heavily, some strange bedfellows, they're investing heavily in watershed protection because, as I saw the chairman of Nestle say, this whole corporate sustainability and responsibility thing is not real investment. That's a couple of high-paid salaries that are walking around with kind of my business cards and some travel saying, we're doing this for the environment. He said, as major companies, we need to invest billions of dollars in protecting watersheds. And look what happens. So you see New York, which has an incredible water supply. Why? Because they've invested in the watershed. They've protected. They've bought the development rights. So they've actually gone in and protected the water rights. And it comes back to the value of water. How much is water worth? Not necessarily the water selling it, the actual who owns it, but how much is water, the value of water for the city of New York? And is New York willing to invest in the watershed upstream?
So, Carl, considering the scope of your introduction with all the different places around the
Yeah.
world, you've highlighted New York just now. What do you see happening other places? Like, is the whole world addressing this, or at least attempting to in the way that New York is?
Well, I'll give an example. In 2008, we had a water breakfast in Davos, again, the World Economic Forum. 6 people showed up. So 2 years later, okay, this is, of course, 7 o'clock in the morning, the night after the Google party, in a hotel that was hard to find, right? The next year, a few more. The next year, it was standing room only, 130 people. Kofi Annan didn't have a seat. So the water issues are rising on the radar. You look at China. President Obama signed a climate bill with the Chinese government back in November. 2 of 6 of the provisions is about water. It's about water and energy research and reducing that impact. So China is really terrified. You look at India and Pakistan, what keeps people awake at the State Department is what happens if there's a water war. And all you have to do is look at Syria. Syria is a battle over water. And then one more thing, look at Arab Spring. A drought in Russia was the butterfly wing that whispered around the Middle East, and you had food prices go up, which led to demonstrations. So that was triggered by water shortages. So you have these hotspots. Sao Paulo, any day now, could go dry. Sao Paulo, Brazil.
Well, two things have occurred to me while we've been discussing this. One, you sort of were talking about the corporate interest and where does that go with water, and there are a lot of us activists that question things like the pipelines. Is that corporate energy worth our water? In the case of the pipeline under our bridge here in the United States, that's a Canadian company that uses our land and goes under our water to take that energy back into Canada. The pipeline eventually either goes back across at Port Huron, or some of that oil, like on Line 6 that followed the Kalamazoo River, that was eventually headed for the Gulf of Mexico, but a lot of that oil is exported. You and I are not using that. So a multinational corporation from another country is utilizing our water, so to speak, to gain their economic advantage. Is that okay? Is that something that we're willing to roll the dice with? It's not for me, and so that's why I fight this pipeline and say we really need to stop that. Same with the Ogallala Aquifer in the middle of our country. That's the breadbasket, something that we're all really, it's part of our patriotic duty to be, the breadbasket of America. We feed the world, but we are threatening those crops by, like what you said, Carl, the water is decreasing. And then if we put these pipelines over it, and if the Keystone XL pipeline were built where they wanted it to be built, it was going to go right over that reservoir, and pipelines leak. And so the native people and the landowners have all said no. Us activists are all saying no, but it's because, do we want the corporate interest that right now is all about energy? Do we want them to be in charge of what happens to our water? I don't.
Yeah, it comes down to education, transparency, and accountability. So you see a company like pipeline companies, they're not necessarily a global brand. So when Coca-Cola had demonstrations outside of a plant in India, that rippled all the way all the way around the world, to the point where the University of Michigan removed Coca-Cola vending machines.
Right.
So you see the visible brands that are saying, hey, we have a risk here. I'm saying that many companies are trying to figure out how to either price that risk or how to manage it. And it's the activism, it's coming to the table, it's holding accountable, the transparency. So the Ogallala Aquifer, it's that huge question. One, do we want to pump it dry? And is that a choice that we're making with all the knowledge? And also the other question is, and I've seen the chairman of Nestle pound on the table saying, no food for fuel. So when you talk about biofuels, we're pumping the aquifer to grow corn to make biofuels. Again, are we willing to do that and to take that risk? So those are some of the big trends we're seeing. I think in some companies are getting it. You have mining companies that have had mines built, multi-billion-dollar mines, like Newmont mine. Newmont it's the Conga mine outside of Lima. A $5 billion mine shut down because of demonstrations from farmers, because they did not manage,
right.
And they admit they did not manage their water and their relationships with the farmers and the communities well.
You just mentioned trends. I know you brought some more images to share with us.
Yeah.
And I think they relate a little bit to where we're trending from here.
Yeah.
Shall we go to the
let's
images? Okay.
Let's do a little forecasting. So if we can put up a couple more pictures here. One of the big trends we're seeing, and this is a picture I took in Manila, in a slum in Manila, and is we're seeing that financing water and sanitation is one of the best investments that a government can make, or even a company, or both, or an NGO, and a non-governmental organization, a nonprofit. And what happens when you do this? This term for equity and growth. That sounds like a nice buzzword. But what happens is, in this slum, when I stayed overnight there, Manila Water brought safe drinking water to this slum. The residents have to pay for it, but they're paying maybe 1% of what they were buying water from the water pirates, these trucks that would come through and sell water to the community illegally. And what happened, you see a child there taking a bath, but what you see is 4 o'clock in the morning, people setting up farm stands and actually selling, being able to sell fish or to sell products because they have that much more money that they're not spending on water. Like the farmers you saw in Mexico, they don't have to spend 40% of their income now on water. And so then they have safe drinking water. So if we go to the next trend, the next slide is, where it will pop up to our next slide. But this is really, it's an exciting trend. It really is transformative. So the value of water, coming back to what is the, I hate to use the term the price of water, but what is the value of water? So Las Vegas saw the value of water was so great that they spent $300 million removing people's front yards, buying their grass, literally, and xeriscaping, which is basically no irrigation for their front yards. So that's a big trend we're seeing as the value of water. And something that's also really exciting is this is a picture I took in Parliament in Mongolia. And we did a 2-day scenario session with the President and Prime Minister of Mongolia and the cabinet as well as their ministers. And what was really exciting to see, first off, what was different, never happened in the history of Parliament in Mongolia, is you see the chairs are turned around. They're facing each other, right? We just turned the chairs around and we said, it was like a Christmas carol. Here are the 3 different futures. Here's a future heavy in mining and heavy in water use and water waste and water pollution and water extraction. Here's a path somewhere down the middle because the illegal mines were draining the water. Or here's a path 30 years into the future, investing in education and a sustainable extraction of, because there's mining of gold, there's mining of copper, which fuels their entire economy. So they can't really shut that down. But how much water are they willing to trade, in a sense, for that sustainable trajectory? So if we go to our next trend too, this is what excites me probably the most, is we talked about water, food, and energy. We talked about the Great Lakes, we talked about the Ogallala, but it's all thinking systemically. How do we tell a story and understand a story that if we pull water from here, we may be affecting an energy supply here or a food supply here or somebody's feelings, somebody's heart and soul, or even the stability of a country or an entire region in the U.S. So those are some of the really big trends. But I think this is thinking systemically, again, back to that water breakfast, and now it's standing room only. The whole idea of the conversation is water, food, energy, climate, geopolitical stability, stability of economies, risks, bottom line. It's a really interesting time to be talking about water.
So who is thinking systemically about the Great Lakes water issues? Is there a group, I know a while back there was a group working with Canada. Canada can suck them dry from the other side. Is there an organization, what is the conversation right now about the future of the Great Lakes? You said it's 20% of the fresh water on the planet. To me, that feels like a really big target to somebody maybe on the other side of the globe who's having serious water issues and saying, hey, there's a big pond over there. Let's go get some of that. Are we going to be putting up battle stations? Are we going to reactivate the fort on Mackinac Island? What's the plan? I'm looking at you because I'm thinking you probably...
Yeah, and the problem is I don't think there is a plan.
That's not good news. That's not good news at all.
There's a lot of groups trying to do a lot of good. And when you asked sort of who's working on stuff in the Great Lakes, I can think of 20 or 30 organizations that are trying to do it and trying to push things kind of up the ladder. I think we actually have a really great representative from the state of Michigan with Debbie Stabenow, who's actually taken on a lot of issues in the Great Lakes region. Things like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative money that's coming into the area to actually try to clean up areas of concern or places that have been polluted, work on invasive species, those sorts of things. I mean, that has been a huge, huge boost to the ability for the Great Lakes to rebound to some of the issues that have happened over the last 50, 100 years. But really, the really big picture, again, we can talk about really small pockets, and here's some things that we're trying to do, and again, a lot of it is sort of moving it up the ladder. and getting somebody to listen to it and kind of take those next steps. But it's all pockets, in my opinion. It's, you know, this group here and this group here focusing on these specific things. And there really isn't a framework for, here's the major threats. Here's what we need to be doing to make sure that, you know, our water doesn't start to get diverted. You know, we've started to make some laws with lots of loopholes, you know, laws that still allow people to take a lot of water out of the Great Lakes Basin. And we have a place to start, which is great. But then it lulls, and we don't take that anywhere. So I really struggle to answer your question because there really isn't, you know, the big picture thing.
Without a governing body or something to...
It's difficult, and you brought up the point of Canada as well. I mean, that complicates the issue. There's, you know, fishing, imaginary sort of line between where your fishing rights are on the United States side and your fishing rights are on the Canadian side, and the same thing is sort of true when you're talking about one single body of water. So it is really difficult. You can say, you know, Michigan, Lake Michigan is probably one of the easier ones to handle because it's all held within the United States. But really, these are issues that we're talking have international implications, and you're trying to get everybody to agree on what the answer is because the United States is dealing with different issues than Canada is, and it's very complicated. So there is no good answer, I think, and I think the way that probably most of us have kind of looked at it as, let's try to do the things that we can for some of those small things and hope that it starts momentum. But we're not there yet.
Yeah, it could be like death from a thousand straws in a way. We won't have. I mean,
you just gave me a real visual. everybody's on the beach with their.
That's a good name for a rock band.
But maybe we should. I mean, that comes back to the art, but telling the story. But we won't have big tankers sneaking water out of the Great Lakes. But when we talk about extraction, we talk about irrigation and unregulated groundwater use. Again, are we willing to pump this groundwater to grow crops that maybe shouldn't even be grown here?
Right.
And are we willing to actually invest in monitoring and understanding? Because, you know, we do have the Great Lakes Compact, we do have these relationships, but we always have to fight so hard in Washington for even the Great Lakes Restoration Funds, which seem to ebb and flow, so to speak. And how do we maintain that level of commitment? And we'll turn to the artists, maybe, you know.
When they turn on their tap and nothing comes out.
That's
true. That's when it will be. And
all of a sudden, they'll be looking this way.
Well, they will be. And it is interesting to see how in different states, for instance, we were talking a little while ago about New York. They've banned fracking now in New York to protect their watershed. That's epic that a governor would look the economic interests straight in the eye and say, no, I'm going to put my water first. And we in Michigan need to do that same sort of thing to protect our water. We need to have strong leadership and visionary leadership to say, no, we are not going to let the corporate interests and the fact that there's a lot of straws, we need somebody looking over that. And if it doesn't come from Washington, then it might need to come from a bioregional approach because the other states that surround us here, we need to work in concert with them. And the needs of Arizona and California are very different. They need to be addressing their bioregional needs, just like we need to protect our bioregional jewels, these beautiful lakes that I really see us as the stewards of these lakes. And we need to educate and agitate and make sure that we all know what's at stake if we say yes or we say no to different initiatives. And so I think it does come down to, instead of Band-Aids, we need some leadership. And I would agree that Senator Stabenow's really trying to step up and say, we've got to get a grip on this before it goes any farther, because as the world looks, exactly what you said, you know, people looking, oh, there's all that water over there. What are they doing with it? We need to be ready and prepared for how will we respond in 10, 15, 20 years as the global shortage of water is affected by global climate shift. What will we say when other people come looking for our fresh water?
I've heard something brought up tonight that I guess I'd not thought of before, and maybe I'm just way behind the curve on this, but going back even to where you were talking about farmers where water is just there to be used, it's very wasteful, versus other farmers are having to buy, 40% of their money is going toward buying water, that's somewhere between having so much water you take it for granted and having so little water that it's too costly. There's this idea of the commodification of water, that seeing it as almost in the same way we do land now. And I don't know, maybe this has been a trend that's been building for years and I was just not aware of it, which is very possible. But it's an intriguing solution to me that, I'm one of the guys who complains about buying bottled water all the time. I'm like, why would you have to buy water? It's right there in the drinking fountain. And yet, it's not that simple. Obviously, there's a whole infrastructure that goes into place for that to be available like that. Is it possible that even the whole bottled water phenomenon of the last several years, as it's exploding, it's kind of training and educating people to see water as something that is more of a commodity, that is a limited resource?
It's part of it comes back to also to valuing and leadership and understanding, what is in water. And when we talk about California's drought, again, how do we value water? When you have water rights, if you have water rights, do you use all your water? It's that whole thing. If you don't spend it all, then they'll take it.
Depends on how scarce it is,
and
how much you value
how
it.
scarce it is. So
Right.
I think that's going to be really the big discussion, is when we're talking about the Great Lakes, when we're talking about China, we're talking about India, what is that water worth? Not necessarily, again, back to who owns it, but if it's not there. So when we are talking about extracting water from the Great Lakes, we need to have a counter argument saying, here's how much this water is worth. Here's how much the fishing industry is worth. Here's how much our economies are worth. And when we also think about this, we need to tell the stories behind it. And I wanted to take just a second, if it's okay, and go back to China, go back to Inner Mongolia for a moment. And you remember Wu Yun, if we can go to the next picture. Wu Yun, our Inner Mongolian shepherd daughter, and with the coal mines behind her. So I went back, and so she had a coal mine over each shoulder, literally. So I went back a year later, and to the next picture, you'll see that the processing stations have grown dramatically. The mines have gotten closer. This is a picture out of her front door.
Wow.
So the mines are getting closer. This is the scale we're talking about. We're talking about the pressure. So to the next picture, we're also looking at the desertification of one of the world's grasslands, the known grasslands. That is dune grass that's like dune grass you'd find at Sleeping Bear. So if we go to the next picture, so the millennial generation is aware of climate change. They're ready to be activists. They're ready to take a role. So this is Wu Yun standing on sand dunes. It looks like Sleeping Bear. This is in Inner Mongolia in the grasslands. This is where sheep should be grazing. So if we go to the next picture, in September I went back again. So this is my third trip back to visit this family, because here for me was really the epicenter of climate change, of water and energy. And so if we go to the next picture, here's the new coal processing facility. So as you can see, it's even bigger this year. And we go to the next picture, the mines are even deeper, and they're growing and getting closer and closer. So Wu Yun's home is that little spot up in the upper right-hand corner, so that we literally had to drive through the mine to get to her house this time. And we go to the next picture. So they're really thinking forward. The younger generation is trying to figure out how to respond to this. And if we go to the next picture, we have the whole world of social media and communication. So literally, I was chatting with Wu Yun today using WeChat, which does auto-translate of Chinese. I mean, how cool is that?
It is so cool.
It's just amazing. But if we go to the next picture,
Is it accurate?
It's pretty accurate. I hope so.
She's getting what you intend
But
for
we're
her.
also seeing this big transition. Again, it comes down to values. So her parents, these are her parents, and they will be selling the farm very soon to the coal mines, because literally they dig coal practically out of the front yard. But we have this whole next generation that has new values, but combined with their history. So a neat little way to wrap up this story was, and it still gets me a little emotional, but the kids, they wanted me to do they had something to tell me. They said, will you do our wedding portraits, our engagement portraits? Oh. So this is Wu Yun's fiance, and the next picture is Wu Yun together. So this is in the grasslands of Inner Mongolia, one of the epic and epicenters of this water, food, energy challenge. But we always have to remember they're real people.
They are real people. But when I see those holes being dug deeper and them taking up more and more space, my internal reaction is, this is not okay with me.
Yeah.
This is not okay that they're being displaced. This is not okay with me that that area, which is supposed to be a grassy plain with sheep grazing, now looks like our sand dunes. I would not have known. If you hadn't told me where she was in that picture, I would have thought she was our guest here in northern Michigan last summer. So when do we say enough is enough? And I do have the same hope as you that the younger generation, we are leaving them some very serious problems to deal with, but they are coming up with amazing ways to bring water out of nowhere in Africa. There are initiatives everywhere where we protect our water more. So I think as it gets more scarce, we will respond. Will we be in time? I can only hope so.
So this is part of that nexus that you're talking about, though, about the water and the energy and everything that we saw happening there. And it strikes me that part of that systemic solution has to be the pursuit of new energy sources.
It does.
Which is a whole other topic to talk about.
We have 2 minutes left, so we can't go there.
And a quick
But
note,
that
one of
is
the
true.
owner of that coal mine in Inner Mongolia, they're investing heavily in solar because they know the end of coal is near.
There you go. It has to come to that. It will come to that.
Yeah.
So scarcity is what will drive that, perhaps. So, you know, where is the line where we cross over into that era where now we're scrambling? How close are we to that?
I think you said earlier is we have to have the solutions ready, and we have to understand, because this summer we have inflection points. We have California, we have the American West. Everybody will be talking about the Great Lakes. It's not economically practical to move water from the Great Lakes to Arizona, but they'll be talking about it, and so we need to be ready with the right messages to say, okay, here is the conversation we need to be having as a nation and as a Great Lakes region.
And how do we protect but also share?
Yeah.
And is that something that we're going to be able to do? That needs to be one of our primary questions, is not only conservation of what we have, but how can we send the good downriver instead of the bad?
And that's the idea that you mentioned earlier. We're trying to steward. We're not trying to hoard. We're trying to protect it, not just for us, but for everyone.
Exactly. Right.
And it might come to that. There might be those who want to start hoarding. It's our water. We're Michiganians. It's our water, and
Or closing the loop.
Again.
Yeah, Michiganians, but we're also going to see the big trend of closing the loop. So we're going to see the big trend of using wastewater for drinking water. Singapore is doing it. Other parts of the world are doing it. We'll be doing it too.
or using salinated water for whatever they use it for to generate the energy sources. Is that what I meant to say? As you were saying,
Yeah.
I thought of that earlier when you're saying they use so much water to produce energy.
Yeah.
Can they use salinated water
Right.
instead of fresh water?
Which will
Those
probably
kinds of
raise a whole
issues.
new
Somebody's working on this
type
somewhere.
of discussion if they use that kind of water. Just because it would tap into a different source and
Yeah,
have its
it's
own
this-
ripple.
And then when it
the
spits
oceans
back
and
out in
it's
the
it's all
ocean,
systemic.
oh my
So how do you
God.
close the
Yeah,
loops?
the butterfly and
how do
the
you close the
whole- yeah.
loops? Yeah.
So it is one macro organism.
Well, we started with the looking down at the big blue ball
Yeah.
and how the water is all connected. And so I feel a tremendous amount of compassion as I stand on the shore of the bay or go to the dunes and look out on my favorite view at number 10 Pierce Stocking Drive, and you can look and you see that water goes on forever. But it doesn't. It doesn't go on forever. So I have a lot of compassion for the people that are lacking it and a lot of concern that we take care of that big blue pond that sits there. We need to really think about how does our having all of that water impact the people that don't have it.
Sure.
So Christine, I'll let you have the final word. Not to put you on the spot in one sentence or so. For the Great Lakes region, for us locally, we've talked a lot about the global issues and that. What do you want our audience to kind of walk away with? What message?
I really think one of the things we struggle with the most is getting people to understand that one person can really make a difference. So we're not going to be able to, get everybody together and all agree on something necessarily, but, the small things that you can do, not watering your lawn when it's raining out, it may seem like a really small thing, but you get enough people that are doing it and you really do make a difference. So, these are really large global problems that really need to start with individual people to have solutions.
Excellent, thank you. thanks to all three of you for joining us this evening and being part of a very, very important conversation. And thank you for proving my point, which I asked at the very beginning. Obviously, water is a really big issue. So thank you, and I thank you, our watching audience at home, for tuning in to In Focus here at the Up North Media Center.